I think it's time for us to get started. I'm going to hand this over to Kat, or Dr. Adam Roberts, otherwise known as.
Thank you. Just to give you a bit of background, I actually work at NTU. I'm a researcher in the business school and the civil engineering school. And we have a booth over here, but I don't really do any art. I write this comic, Mad Scientist Cat. And Jess, who's currently drawing something, is the artist for that. And the whole point of this talk is to discuss the science of reading comics. And I'm coming at this from the angle of psychology, neuroscience, and linguistics. Now, I personally don't do any research in this area, so I recommend, if you're really interested in this, go buy this book, Visual Language of Comics. This guy is like the biggest researcher in this area. And this field of psychology of comics is really new. It's less than 10 years old. And he used to work in the US, used to go to all the big Comic-Cons and run these big science panel talks, and now is an assistant professor in the Netherlands. So I recommend this book. I recommend going to his website. You can download all of his papers. He really does really interesting research. I'm going to start out with a kind of a statement that people may not agree with. Comics, I would say, are a language. And there's various evidence that shows that comics can be seen as language. For a start, if you're reading text and the words are completely jumbled up, it'll take you a long time to read a sentence. If a sentence makes sense and is like a coherent story, you can read it a lot faster. In the same way, if you take comic sequences of images and jumble them up, they take a lot longer to get through than if they make a coherent story. And this is because both languages and comics, they have grammar. So languages, even sign language, they all have a specific grammar to them. And now each language has a slightly different grammar, but they all have some sort of grammar. And this is a set of rules that can't be broken. If you mess around with it, it doesn't make sense anymore. In the same way, comics have these rules, and you can't break these rules. If you do break these rules, they don't make sense. Now, I've got an example here. I'm going to ask JF, since he's at the front, if you were going to label, these are examples of panels from a comic. If you're going to label the first 9 images, 9 panels from a comic, where would you start? Top left, okay. Panel 2? So the next one over, okay. Panel 3? Top right, okay. Panel 4? Okay, so he's gone to the middle left. So what JF is doing is he's getting something a bit like this. Now notice JF did not go 1, 2, 3 and jump across to panel 4 on the next side over. This is just because there's a big guttering there, and comics make use of this. If you have a big guttering, people will automatically jump down. This is why you don't read straight across a spread of 2 pages, okay? Now, if you were a manga reader, where would you start? Top right, and why is that? Yeah, because Japanese starts top right, right? And then it'll look something like this. So there's a language of comics, but the language is not necessarily universal. Japanese language is different to English language. And the question is, if you present comics to people that haven't got much experience in comics, will they understand that this is the correct layout? Now, this has actually been tested because a lot of the time researchers, they go off to faraway places, look at indigenous tribes, and if these indigenous tribes don't have written language and you want to try and talk to them about this sort of stuff, you can present a series of images. And if you give a sequence of 3 images to an English speaker, they will look at it and they'll go, okay, so this is the same person here, there, and there, and they move, they do something. Japanese speaker, okay, potentially we'll go in the opposite direction, but we'll work it out. But people who don't have language may not even recognize that the person is copied across the 3 panels. They may identify it as three different but identical looking people doing different things, all presented at the same time. So it appears that you have to learn this visual language. And if I make the layout a bit more complicated, people generally can understand it. And there's this paper by Cohen and Campbell, released in 2015. They gave 200 people different layouts without numbering and asked them to number these layouts. And in general, people, if you see something like the one on the left, they'll understand that the first panel, even though it's a full length, you read it first and then you go the standard route all the way through. And this route is called Z-pathing. So you go across horizontally, then you drop down to the next line, you go across again. If you get something more complicated, like panel 8 here, this is called blocking, and what happens is people will automatically jump down to the next line and then leave that one till later, so they follow the bottom edge of the panels. And of course you can keep making these more complicated, and if you look at the one on the left, when you get to panel 6, because this blocks, people will drop down 4 and 5 vertically, jump to 6, and then jump back up to 7 and 8. And you can keep making this more complicated, and I've done 2 blocking panels here to show how complicated you can get. So the question is, how complex should you make a comic? And this depends on your readers. So young children are going to be different to adults. People who have not much experience with comics are going to be different to people who have read comics all their lives. Now, if you take someone who's an adult, who's read a lot of comics from, back in the day, all the classic DC Marvel comics, they actually require a more simplistic layout than younger people. And this is because they've grown up with these very, very simplistic layouts, which are just simple panels, 1, 2, 3, and then down and across. Younger kids are growing up now with much more complex layouts in their comics, and they are finding it easier and faster to pick up these more complicated strategies. But if you look at something like this, which is really complex, you've got to question whether this is even useful at this point. An example is, there's a comic that I have not put the panel in here, you can find it online. There's a DC comic artist who made a very complex layout deliberately to confuse people. And in this study, the 2015 study, they actually asked people, how would you number this comic? And out of 200 people, only 18 people chose the same path. Everyone else chose slightly different paths. And some people refused to try to do the numbering, because they said it was too difficult. You couldn't actually find a route. And you can kind of see it like in this example here, where you end up with a panel that gets skipped over because people can't find a sensible visual strategy to get through it. This can be the same as in language. So you can have very complicated sentences. So I have these sentences on the side. And if you parsed this is what we call a garden path, because you start at this top one, the horse raced past the barn, fell, which makes no sense. Or the old man the boats, again, makes no sense. What you need to do is, you need to have a bit more knowledge, a bit more prior knowledge of the sentence. And then you can understand that with context, the first one is more like the horse that was raced past the barn fell over. And the second one is the old, as in old people, man, they work on boats. And so it's possible that people will understand this very complicated layout that you'll have to drop vertically first and then go across and then drop vertically at the end. But if you're not needing to make such a complicated layout, only do it if you're deliberately trying to confuse people. Now, there's a few different types of research in this area, but it is a very new area in the field. And one thing that's just started being used is looking at brain waves when researching comics. Now, this cap you see on the side, this has a lot of different electrodes in it. We call this electroencephalography. And it picks up on very minute electrical changes on the surface of the scalp. And these are changes that are happening just in the outermost layers of your brain, and the neurons that are in groups that are all firing at the same time are all responding to the same sort of stimulus. And from this we can identify different patterns. I've got an example for here, which is some example brain data I've recorded, and it looks essentially meaningless, right? And I've been doing EEG now for what, like 14 years. And you'd think that after 14 years I'd be able to look at this and say, okay, I know what someone's thinking based on these signals. And I can tell you, well, if I filter it, it looks a bit nicer, but no. But I mean, I can say that there's some eye movements there. That's useful. Eye movements are much easier to pick up than actual brain recordings. The electrical potential that's generated by the eye is huge in comparison to the signals that we're actually looking for. And we have to kind of remove these when we do our data analysis. What you need to do is you need to identify windows of interest. And this would be if you're getting someone to read through a comic, you make it so when they get to a specific panel of the comic, you can identify the exact time that they've looked at it and take out that exact amount of brain signal. What you need to do then is take many times of them looking at either the exact same panel of the comic or similar types of panels. So for example, if you're looking at how a comic confuses you, you need to take confusing panels only and compare them to each other. And what you do is you take all of these together for one person and then for multiple people, average them all together. This removes all the noise that you get in the signal, it removes the eye movements, and what you're left with is something a bit like this. This is from a paper I wrote back in 2014, and this is actually just in language, not in comics now. But the response you see here, the two different brain waves, they change at about 400 milliseconds through this item. And in comics, you can find a similar response. So this is in a sentence. If you take a sentence like Superman jumped off the ledge and flew, that makes sense to comic readers, right? But if you took a sentence, Superman jumped off the ledge and exploded, this is unexpected. And the neural signature for an unexpected word will be different to an expected word. And you can see this just 400 milliseconds after they've initially encountered that word. And in comics, we can see something similar. So these are example individual waveforms, and depending on the type of unexpected response, you'll get a different neural signature. So for example, when the previous panel doesn't match the panel of interest, then you get this N400 response. This is like the Superman exploding response. If the previous panel is ambiguous, you get this exactly opposite response, what they call a late positivity, which shows that they're trying to make sense of this ambiguous data and incorporate it into the structure of the sentence. Another way we can look at this, which I think is a little more useful actually, is eye tracking. And there's this fantastic picture of me there, which I'm wearing these eye tracking goggles. They have little cameras in that point at your eye, and they look at the distance between the center of your pupil and this little reflection dot. And that little reflection dot will be from a light that gets shone gently at your eye. It's infrared light, so you can't see it. And using those 2 points, you can find the direction of eye movement and the exact point you're looking at in space, in like XYZ coordinate space. And the reason this is really important is when you're looking at a sentence or reading a comic, you don't fixate the entire page in one go. You can only see a very small amount of space in focus. It's approximately the area of your thumb. If you stick out your arm, arm's length, and look at your thumb, that will be your focal range. When reading a sentence, it's approximately 4 or 5 letters. After that, the signal is degraded, and this is because in your eye, the center point of your eye where you focus has a lot more cone cells, which are the color vision response cells in your eye. I have a video here which I'm hoping is going to play. So this is an example of a person reading a comic. And what you should be able to see is, it's a little slow, but this is the eye movements jumping first to like the text and then the items in each individual frame. And what you should be able to see is that, in general, the description of a Z path is approximately correct. So you start at the top left of the panel, and you work your way across the panels in a sort of a Z strategy. But what you might notice is that describing reading comics as a Z path is simplistic at most. So there's many different points of visual interest in a comic, and you're not going to go purely from a left to a right strategy, jumping panel to panel, especially when the fixation size you're looking at within that panel is potentially very, very small. And depending on the complexity of the layout, people will either follow a Z path. Sometimes they'll get confused and they'll have to jump back. And especially if you have something like a pun, an unexpected sentence, people will often jump back to try and make sense of it. And I think the next one is hopefully a much more complicated layout. No, it's the same, okay. Okay, so what we end up with is, hang on, I'm going to skip on this if I can. Yeah, so this may make a little more sense. It's a little easier to see than the video. And what you can see from this, which I've chosen because it's a relatively simple layout, is you are getting this Z path thing that I talked about before. You start at the top left and you work your way down, kind of going across left to right and then jump down across left to right again. You'll also notice that the person doesn't just fixate on text, right? So people tend to look at faces a lot. And as soon as you looked at a face, the next thing you will look at is where the face was looking. And if you're trying to lead someone's eye movements through a comic, you have to kind of keep this in mind. If they look at a face, the next direction they will go is the direction they're looking. And if you're trying to lead them quickly through a panel, it's best to look at the next panel. And I'm going to move to a more complicated panel now. And this really shows that the Z path idea breaks down as soon as you get to slightly more complex layout. So the panel layout isn't complex. But what we have is a combination of speech bubbles and people that they're going to be looking at. And so it's kind of starting at the top left again, but what you're ending up with is a top to bottom and then back up to the top to check out the face. Z pathing through the actual speech balloon itself, and then taking a circular path around panel 2. And then when it gets to the last panel, there's so many items of visual interest that it really just starts bouncing around a lot. And I'm going to take, this is Kelly's, well of course Kelly's left, but this is Kelly's comic. And I did eye tracking of this as well, because this is very complicated, and this as well is a 2-page spread. And the question is, how do people read this? Now, this is only one person, just so you know, but here, the person reading does not jump across the page, so they do understand that this is like a 2-page spread, and they read down. But again, as you can see, this Z path is not really that clear. And what they're doing is they're jumping between the images of the people, the text, and working their way down. And each time they're looking at faces, and then the direction that the face is looking. Now, technology is coming on, and we're not really looking necessarily at printed comics anymore. Each of those were static images, once I put them on a monitor. Now we're looking at webcomics. This gets even more complex, because now you're not necessarily moving your eyes down, because you can move the page up. And then, how does this affect your eye movements? Now, often what people will do is they will fixate a certain area and then they make a saccadic eye movement. During the saccadic eye movement, they don't actually focus on anything. And so you're only really seeing a clear picture at each fixation. And you see again the Z path has kind of disappeared here because you're getting more like a horizontal scanning strategy. And I'm gonna skip on a little bit from this video. But yeah, basically again it's very similar to the previous video I showed you, but without such an obvious vertical movement. Now, loads of people are reading webcomics on phones as well now, and I was kind of trying to get a decent video of this. Unfortunately, about halfway through this video I realized that I was holding the phone too far away from my face to actually show anything. But the issue here is that this is so small now when you're looking at a phone that people can take in a lot more information at the same time. They may not be looking too much at the details anymore. And this may mean that you need to design your comic differently if it's on a mobile device. And there are ways that some people have tried to get around this. So, for example, here, this is Kelly Starburn comic again. This is on Comixology. Comixology has developed this system to guide you through reading a comic. And what it does is it zooms in to individual panels and zooms out again. I'm not entirely convinced that this is a good strategy. What it does is it's completely removing the Z path, the navigation, from your remit. This is now entirely externally navigated. And while it does work, and people seem to be able to recognize where they should read next, it sometimes gets a little confusing, especially when it has to zoom out to get a very wide panel. So I'm not entirely sure I would recommend this, but you know, there you go. If it's on Comixology, I think it does it by default. So I'm going to end there, I think. But yes, the important things, I guess, to take away from this talk are that this is a really new field of research. So it's less than 10 years old. There's mainly one guy who does most of the research in this area, and I think it's an area that will get growth now, especially because these types of neuroscience recordings are getting a bit cheaper. I mean, the portable EEG kits now, you can get consumer-grade models for about $400. I think I've hopefully been able to convince people that comics, I think, can be classed as a visual language. If you have a rule violation in the comic, either through the grammar of the comic or the semantics of the comic, you'll get a similar neural signature than if you have a rule violation in a language. And this strategy is similar to other languages. Of course, every language is different. So what you have really is you have an English visual language, you have a Japanese visual language. Other languages may have slightly different reading strategies. And I think that reading comics is much more complicated than reading text. And so I think the work that's been done in linguistics about sentence reading is incredibly basic in comparison to what could be done with comics. Okay, thank you. If you have any questions, let me know.
Any questions for...
Hang on. There we go.
Have you tried the eye tracking on a piece of manga? Because that would be very different if you compare the layout of the Japanese manga and how the size of the B5 size. It actually, the eyes move a lot faster when you read manga, because that's what I observe personally. When I consume a piece of manga, I can finish one whole book in about half an hour. Versus if I were to read a typical close to A4 size or full-colored Marvel comics, it takes me very long to just finish one page. And it is an actual observation by a Japanese guy on paneling and how the Japanese aesthetics in paneling actually promotes eye movement. So they will purposely cut down the complexity and the aesthetics of the characters in order to facilitate eye movements. But then on the other hand, the American comics, it's all about how beautiful each panel is, muscles and everything else. So this is something that is quite interesting. That just reminds me totally about that.
Yeah, thanks. That is really interesting. I was actually trying to find some example that I could put in here. I was trying to also make sure I didn't use any copyrighted material, which is obviously very difficult. I haven't then looked at eye tracking of Japanese manga, and I'm not sure if anyone's released a paper on this yet. I do know that there have been studies of the paneling layout, as you said, and the reading path can be sometimes really complicated in manga. So, because sometimes people don't even use proper panels, they'll just have images on a white background. You can easily get like a C-shaped path, for example, or an S-shaped path going down the page. And it depends as well what the artist is going for, because some artists, if they're deliberately trying to make an uncomfortable feeling in the reader, then they will deliberately make a page that does not end in the usual place. So you sort of read around, maybe into a spiral, for example. But I think there's a lot that can be done in cross-cultural examination of comics. And while Japanese manga and American style are the two main ones that have been compared at the moment, I think it'd be interesting even to look at, for example, Southeast Asian comics, see if they do it any differently. Because, I mean, I guess to some extent they either copy the American style or they copy the manga style. But it'd be interesting to see if there are any that use their own style. Although I don't know if that answers your question at all, but...
I have just a comment, because last year I attended a storyboarding class by a teacher called David Wu, who's worked in major Hollywood studios, Disney and some of the big ones, and he was talking about like when you do storyboarding for movies, for feature films, which has a 16:9 aspect ratio, you try to minimize the eye movement. So if there's a main character speaking in this corner, and then when you cut to the next shot, you don't put the main character on the other side, because it means that the audience has to look to the other side. So but if you need to guide the eye to the other side, then you have this person walk or have the camera pan so that the eye will follow. It's something that I started thinking about when you were doing the presentation.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing that really shows the difference between storyboards and comics. Because for storyboards you have to imagine what it's going to be like when it's in film. For comics, you have to try to lead the reader around your page. So there's no point in always having the focus of interest on the left-hand side, because they're going to have to jump their eye movements anyway. The important thing for comics is, if you're wanting to make it clear that, panel 1 goes left, panel 2 goes down, then you really should be leading the eye movements of the person around that way. And you can do it, for example, through the direction that the person's pointing. You can do it through, for example, visual interest. The comic previously that I showed, you have the cat, and then you have it looking at the coffee mug. That will bring your eyes down to that, and then that's in the bottom right, so then you'll either go down or right from there. And it's for film, I guess it can be very different, but but for film and storyboarding, I guess that the issue with storyboarding is getting the idea of the movement there without necessarily drawing every single frame out exactly how it is. You've got the movement of the person across the frame, but you're not going to draw every single frame that will go into the movie, right? Thank you.
Any more questions for Ken? Thank you very much.
Thank you.